Today, we'll have a fascinating conversation with Miguel Conner, the host of the Eon Byte Gnostic Radio, author of many books, but especially The Voices of Gnosticism and most recently 10 Snackable Meditations. Hi, Miguel, how are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on.
Wonderful. So I just want to say that I first got to know you through your book, The Voices of Gnosticism, and I recommend it very highly for everybody because it gives you a fantastic overview of every possible Gnostic movement through I think there are transcripts of the interviews from your show, right? So
Yeah.
when I started to be interested in Gnosticism, this was like the ideal book, So I have all legitimate sources, very approachable, and through basically the major scholars in the field, but in a very approachable way. So that was a wonderful book, and I know that you have a sequel to this book as well, right? The Other Voices of Gnosticism, also a fantastic book. So for me, Miguel is this example of Gnostic sage and complete Gnostic aficionado and complete well of knowledge on Gnosticism, because I know that scholars from experience that scholars usually like to go to their own little tunnel, and all they know is the beginning, the middle, and possibly the end of a tunnel. But it is very rare to meet someone who knows pretty much everything on the topic, because he is not limited by strange rules of academia and so on. So although academia can be sometimes supportive of our research, in many ways it is very limiting. So it's wonderful to have you, Miguel.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I certainly appreciate what scholars do, but yeah, I think history is one thing, but how a religion impacts us is always our culture, our art, and the
Yes.
ancients, I'm sure, were no different. They had their own pop culture, their own culture, their own psychology, consciousness to see it. So seeing it in a more holistic way always helps. And again, how it impacts us today, what's the stream and where things might be going. So it's nice to contribute in that way. But yeah, I appreciate all these scholars who put countless amount of hours in the field to bring insights that help those of us who are not just learning, but want to experience something mystical or greater from these groups, or try to understand our culture around us and how it's been influenced.
Yes, and quite recently I just posted something innocent, I thought, on Facebook, and I got a feedback immediately. We live in Gnostic times, Joanna. That's why. So obviously, it is somehow relevant. But first, I would like to ask you, how actually you encounter the path of Gnosticism, if there is such thing, because it's such a broad group, the Gnostics. But how did you? What happened there? How actually you started to think about Gnostics? Because usually people come to spirituality in the West, through yoga, or they got interested in Buddhism, or they went to India, you know what I mean? And it's not such a common thing, to be interested in Gnosticism and take it up in such a serious way that you did.
Yeah, I can't say there was a road to Damascus experience or under a Bodhi tree. You might say it was a slow burn, like all of us. So you're looking for the big questions in life. Why am I here? What happens after we die? The nature of evil, all that other good stuff. And Gnosticism, I've always been very ecumenical. I love all religions almost equally. I don't think there's one that's less or more deficient than the other. They're all just part of the same search for what is human and what is reality. But Gnosticism started answering those questions more and more. But if you want to say when it, like, as they say, got under my skin or was injected in my blood, I'd probably say reading Philip K. Dick's Valis, because this was an individual who not only had studied Gnosticism, but he was able to translate it in a modern way through science fiction and philosophical speculative fiction. And he really opened my eyes, because I realized, yes, this is the world we live. This is the warning of the Gnostics. And again, he was able to translate it in a way that made complete sense to me. And even then, I remember reading Valis, and you're getting interested in Gnosticism, and you're like, oh, cool, Mary Magdalene, Sophia, they have a divine feminine. But in Dick's Valis, Sophia does make an appearance as the savior figure, but it's a very, you might say, sad ending. Let's put it this way. The good guys do not win in Philip K. Dick's cosmology or in his mythology, because Valis is also his great speculation on the cosmos and what will happen. So that I remember annoying the shit out of me. But of course, instead of just rejecting it, I said, well, why? And of course, you start studying and you realize, yes, Sophia is in the Old Testament, but she's in a cloud. She's abandoned. The Shekinah is crying for her people. The book of Enoch says men rejected wisdom, and she's now in a cloud. And you realize, well, he's not wrong. The goddess is there, but unfortunately, we have marginalized her, and now it's a matter: are we going to welcome her back or no? I would say, I don't know. I don't know yet.
Yes, we will have to look into this. So this was actually through the work of fiction. So could you introduce him to our listeners? Because not everybody needs to know him right away.
Well, he is the prophet of our times. I think if you look at Philip K. Dick's predictions on how the world would be today, from social media to big tech giants to how we interact, how you and I are interacting right now, you can read his works, and it's all there. It's eerie. And of course, Dick is famous for being the mind behind cultural, impactful movies like Blade Runner, Minority Report, Total Recall, The Adjustment Bureau, and the very popular TV series, The Man in the High Castle. So your viewers or listeners will know that he is very socially relevant, and what he did is made a huge impact on our world. And your listeners will realize, yeah, a lot of what he predicted, from The Man in the High Castle to Blade Runner, seems to be, at least on a thematic level, have come true today.
And something to do also with the development of artificial intelligence and so on, right?
Exactly.
As being the crazy gods that actually create a life that we cannot understand. We understand very little about our own lives, and here we are creating, and we are at the moment creating another form of life. Do you think that he was a mostly visionary, or was it coming from some spiritual experience? I know that I read something that he was getting some download, in conspiracy theories, they say there is this black knight orbiting the earth and so on, and there's this AI thing that was downloading, something to his brain. So do you have an opinion about that?
Well, he had several mystical experiences. He had a very, I guess, sordid and disturbed life for various reasons, but he had some experiences that changed his life. He really, again, Valis, he saw as a sort of benign satellite or AI or spiritual being. He never really says what it is, that's trying to wake us up from this hologram or simulation that we live in. And his most famous vision was when well, it's a long story, but he suddenly saw that we did live in a hologram, and we still were living in the second century. And he was the Apostle Thomas, and this secret group of Christians called the Gnostics were trying to fight the empire, the Roman Empire, that had created this hologram with the help of what he called, well, he called him the demiurge, but he called him other names like a dangerous magician and all that. And time had really stood still, and we were all trapped in this terrible simulation, trying to escape and return to the stars. We were all basically aliens. And he had visions like that, and some of his prophecies came true. He was able to this being Valis that would send you pink beams. That was his version of downloads. Warned him to his son being very sick, and all of a sudden he knew his son was sick, and he grabbed his son told his wife, Tessa Dick, we're going to the hospital. And oh my God, the doctor found out he had a hernia that was about to explode, and he saved his son's life. So he had predictions, or he had things like he would write a novel, and then suddenly it would happen in real life. And it could be something mundane, like meeting a guy at a gas station who said certain words to him, and these were verified by other people. So he was definitely a madman and a mystic, which is what I think any modern Gnostic should be.
And
I
also, I
mean,
think every mystic has to be a little bit of a madman or a madwoman. I mean, because you go completely against the main narrative of what society is telling you is right or wrong, right? What is true or
yeah.
not true. So in
What
this,
did Stefan Heller say? What's the difference between a mystic and a madman? A mystic knows to keep his mouth shut.
yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. That's a very good definition. But let's go back to the origins of Gnosticism because there is some debate there. And I remember when I started to be interested in it, and now I know it's wrong because I was completely relying on Elaine Pagels, was that she said that Gnostics are basically a branch of Christianity. But recent scholarship says that they are much older than that, perhaps have to do something with the hermeneutic, the traditions of Egypt. And what is your opinion about that?
I would agree. I mean, it's kind of a straw man of how old they are. We
Mm.
do know, I mean, we can safely say, especially when you read newer scholarship like April DeConnick or Dylan Burns, that they were the carriers or the descendants of the ancient Egyptian mysteries. I mean, that's right there. If you look at the rituals, their language, all that, they were taking this ancient, these psychopomps, or I'm sorry, these hierophants or Egyptian priests were handing this down as the Egyptian mysteries were dying during the late antiquity and the rise of the Roman Empire. These Gnostics came from them, either as the Christian Gnostics or as the Hermetics, and I think that's a pretty sound idea. Also, and I don't even know if this is just as radical, but then you have the ideas of James McGrath. He's also a scholar. He says when you look at the language of Mendeans and other Gnostics, they have the same words and names for angels and gods that you only find in pre-exilic Hebrew. So he thinks that not only were they taking the Egyptian mysteries, but it's possible that they were the carriers of the ancient shamanistic Hebrew dispensation with the Shira and the spirits and all that. And these kind of went underground and then came up because, again, the idea of Sophia or Barbelo being an extension of a Shira or not is pretty obvious. And again, these scholars have seen that they have yeah, they have the words there, the terminology, the gods. So that's a pretty, again, that's also another possibility of or another stream of how the Gnostics might have happened.
Even linguistic similarities. But I will
Yeah,
ask you a
well, let
question.
me say one more thing. Yeah, and that's what this Dr. Justin Sledge was telling me. By the time of Jesus or before the time of Jesus, Hebrew and Aramaic or Hebrew was dead.
Mm,
And you look at somebody like Philo of Alexandria.
mm,
Philo of Alexandria does not speak a lick of Hebrew or Aramaic. He's
mm,
just coined Greek. When
yes.
you look at the Scythians, they are using very ingenious Aramaic and Hebrew puns that very few people might have even known. So again, that's another hint that they really were carrying this very ancient Hebrew mystical dispensation with them. So it's interesting. They were very embedded in what Judaism was, but as scholars also have agreed, they were probably disenfranchised Jews. They had it with the temple, the corrupt Second Temple culture, had it with the Roman Empire. They just had it, and they decided we're going underground, and we're just going to take this information, and ended up in Egypt.
So just for our listeners, the Scythians were just one of the many Gnostic groups, because sometimes people think that Gnostics are just some coherent group, but it was far from it. So the Scythians were just one of the groups. So I would like to ask you a question that I ask also to Tobias Churton. And do you think that these traditions actually come from Egypt? And you sort of answered, and perhaps from early Judaism, or whether they came from the East, like from India via Persia and so on? Because this is also a scholarly discussion about that. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost obviously Gnosticism and Buddhism are sister religions. Now,
Mm-hmm.
whether is this is the human consciousness, where as Joanna Kujawa said, we our minds work in zeros and ones. One idea is going to be the solar male organized. This is civilization. The other one's going to be the anarchist, holistic, embedded in nature, and this is always going to happen. I mean, Buddhism, like Gnosticism, was a reform movement. It was critical. It was anarchist. It was about the interior world of every human being instead of the. So whether there's a connection, I don't know. But with when you look at Zoroastrianism, by default in those times, as much as other religions want to deny it, everybody was influenced by Zoroaster. I mean, he was the I don't know, Elvis Presley. Or think of a great musician. People
Mm.
can deny you're not influenced by them. It's like, well, I'm not influenced by Aristotle. Everybody's influenced by Aristotle because of logic and all this. So Zoroaster was huge, and he influenced the Jews in Babylon. He influenced Egypt. He influenced I mean, or the later, definitely the Babylonians. He was like his work on dualism and powers and light and darkness was a huge influence. So obviously it would have influenced the Gnostics too. I mean, although obviously Plotinus says they are too dependent on the Orient, they're too dependent on Zoroaster. But
Ah.
again, he had the Gnostics definitely loved his ideas of light and darkness and good and evil and all this other stuff.
That's very interesting, thank you. Because actually, Tobias Churton also thought that it's coming from there, that it came via Persia, from India, and and from the what we call the Far East. I prefer the idea that our human consciousness evolves naturally this way. That we are seeking these answers, but of course there are trade routes and so on. So it is quite possible that the idea is moved, but I think our internal life is taking us there as well.
Yeah, and
So,
it's hard because we don't know. We really don't know when Zoroaster was born. Some say
ah.
300, 600. Some have him, 2000 BC. So it's kind of hard. But like you said, the human mind is always going to have the Gnostic minded, the mystically minded, just as you're going to have those who want a structured religion. And that's the play within all of our minds, and that's the play within humanity.
Yeah, so it's like a play of consciousness in a way, between, as you say, something more holistic and anarchic, and something looking for organization and numbers. And again, we live this reality even now.
Yeah.
Because it is a short podcast, Miguel, I would really like you to go into the Gnostic goddesses, such as, I don't know, maybe Noria, Barbello, Sophia. We discussed Sophia in your past podcasts, but she's so big in Gnosticism as well. So pick one and just go with it, and then we move on to Mary Magdalene with the rest of the time.
Pick one for,
For
God, it's
a
hard
Gnostic
because.
goddess.
Well, it's hard because when you realize they're all the facet of the same goddess,
Mm-hmm.
appearing or manifesting in different ways on Earth and in their stories and in their myths. It's that dream quality. I'm sure you see that in Hinduism too. That's you know a lot more about that than I do. So it's almost hard to say where Barbelo starts and Sophia ends, or where Mary Magdalene starts and Sophia ends. And of course, as I said, it's obvious that these are taken from ancient times, from Ashira, and of course her shadow side, or her other side, Anat. I think that's something that gets that modern New Agers have dropped the ball, because we think the goddess is, oh, love and light. Love. It's like, no, bullshit. Just like the male goddess,
Yes.
there's a good aspect and there's a bad. You're gonna live with it or don't live with it. There's for Ashira, the nurturing. There's Anat, the destructive, raping, shadow side. Even people always think of Aphrodite. They forget, Aphrodite she had her shadow side. She was really the goddess of war. Athena was wisdom, but she could be as cruel as any being in this universe. So you have the in Gnosticism, you have Sophia, but the Gnostics talked about Achamoth, or the wisdom of death, or they would say Sophia is the mother of the angels being the archons, or they would say she's the queen of Hades. So they saw that shadow side, and they were again taking from this primordial goddess that had slowly been marginalized and censored by the cult of Yahweh, the cult of Marduk, and all that. And they use the work you've done, and you've mentioned her in past podcasts, is fascinating, because you've talked about Nimna, who was, I think, Enki's other better self or consort. And this power is there about these two helper gods, because in the what most people overlook in the myth of Prometheus is a great Gnostic tale where Prometheus wants to help humanity. Zeus wants to create these slaves. He makes Prometheus create them, and Prometheus feels bad, and he says, I'm going to steal fire from the gods. But they forget that who helps Prometheus get into Olympus? It's Athena. So you have how Enki and Nimna help humans against the other Anunnaki. You have that playing off in Athena and Prometheus, and in Gnosticism you have it too, because in their myths, in the garden is Yaldabaoth, the demented creator god, the son of Sophia. He can't get Adam to get up, and Sophia has to breathe or trick him to breathe his essence to bring him. So that's right there. You've got Sophia playing Athena, and you've got Yaldabaoth playing Prometheus or Enki. Obviously, details are changed, and this one, suddenly the demiurge is the bad guy, but you have this play of male and female helping humanity against a huge order of creation. And these gods, whether it's Sophia or Prometheus or Nimna, they're all these trickster archetypes that go against the flow of the divine, that bring change and transition, and ultimately bring humanity to be its best or worst side. So I hope I didn't go on a tangent here. Sorry.
No, that was very
Not inspired to go there. Okay.
You know, we can plan these things, but the best interviews are completely spontaneous. But just, you know, for the sake of our listeners, can you bring up some similarities between Sophia and Mary Magdalene?
Yeah, I mean, obviously both, when you look at the divine plan, as above, so below, the Gnostics would certainly agree, and well, they're not alone. All the mystics would agree too, that you've got the logos. That's the male principle of reason, sustenance, the idea of being logical or seeing things as they are. And then you've got the principle of wisdom, the divine one, more holistic, more nurturing, more encompassing to an extent. You're like, yeah. I mean, well, they both, it's better alone, it's not good, but both together are good for the mind of God not to be crazy, and for humanity to come. And this manifests in many tales, whether it's Isis or Osiris and so many others. So in the Gnostic, and you could even say the Christian one, that's where Mary Magdalene represents the wisdom, and Jesus represents the logos. And just like in us, also you've got Simon Magus and Helen of Troy, or Helen of Tyre, also appears in a parallel myth. And so you have this tale of these two principles that have been separated and are trying to find each other to restore the world. Obviously, Christianity marginalized Mary Magdalene, but to the Gnostics, she was an important bringer of wisdom. She was a Gnostic revealer. She was a Hierophant, just like Ellen was. And these beings were obviously, the Gnostics would consider them manifestations of Sophia on earth, just like other beings were the manifestation of the Logos on earth. So right there, and yeah, when you read the stories of them looking for each other and trying to find each other, interacting in a play of words, you do get that Sophia Logos vibe for sure.
And very briefly, could you tell us something about Simon the Magician and Helen, because they are really like the parallel couple, you said, to Mary Magdalene and Yeshua or Jesus or Christ consciousness. Yeah.
As I say, Jesus and Mary Magdalene are like the Beatles. Simon and Ellen are like the Rolling Stones, because in their group it was kind of like wild sex and drugs and partying, but Simon Magus, again, according to tradition, John the Baptist was the leader. He was the guy he was bringing those ancient Hebrew mysteries, right?
Mhm.
He had handpicked Simon Magus. So, and Ellen was part of he had 30 disciples. And Ellen was a bona fide, she was the only woman, but she was equal to everybody else. But John the Baptist picked Simon, and he and Ellen eventually, when John was killed, and some say Jesus also met a bad death, it was Simon and Ellen who would spread these mysteries in a mythological way. You have this idea that's not that very common in Gnosticism, where you have the first thought of the divine is always female, just like you have Shiva and Prakriti. You've got consciousness and the experience. The experience is a woman because consciousness asks the questions, who am I? What am I about? And it's kind of like he penetrates her and she says, you are this. I will give birth to you are power, you are wisdom, you are eternity. In one of the Gnostic myths, she is the first thought, but as creation is happening, these angels, these lower angels or archons, kidnap the first thought and take her down to earth and cast her in a human body named Ellen, and they hide her throughout history. She's Helen of Troy, she's a prostitute in a brothel, she's all these figures because they want her power, because that gives them power. So the primal consciousness basically says, well, I got to find my first thought or I'm just crazy. And the consciousness manifests as Simon Magus, who is basically the supreme God on earth. And it's his job to find her throughout time. And eventually, as Simon Magus, he finds her in a brothel, Ellen. Once they're together, then they're complete, just like when Jesus and Mary Magdalene are complete. And they're able to spread this message across the world to other humans who might be asleep to the truth of this world, that it's been run by these deficient, greedy angels. So that's sort of the myth right there. But again, their sects were not like the Christians. They were into sex magic, drugs, and all this. They were the Rolling Stones.
They're the Rolling Stones, right? So
Yeah.
I love this comparison. So now this is a final question for us today. Can you tell us how Gnosticism is relevant for us today? As somebody, as I told me we live in Gnostic times, Joanna. So we would like to hear your take on that.
Well, the simple question is something I could go on and on and on about, but let's look at simulation theory. The Gnostics were the first individuals in the West, East, let's leave East off the table because there's probably a lot about, who said we live in a simulation, we live in a hologram. It's not like the East where it's a nice illusion, but somebody on purpose coded this reality and has kept us trapped. Maybe it's us, maybe we forgot, maybe it's some archons, that's depending on the Gnostic sect. Maybe it's a necessary thing, maybe it's benign, maybe it's malevolent. But the Gnostics said we live in a hologram. This is not reality, this is not real. We belong outside of this simulation, this video game. They were mocked. I mean, all these religions in the West were like, you narcissist, schizophrenic, crazy Gnostics, ha 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 ha. And Western religions did just completely ignored the idea of a simulated theory. I think Descartes talks about, well, what if a demon has created this reality and I must think my way, I think therefore I am. But maybe in fairy lore, you might have this idea of simulated reality and parallel universes. But it was the Gnostics who really championed this. Well, guess what? Simulated theory is now a very logical, mathematical, and scientific reality. You look at Neil Bostrom, you look at Neil deGrasse Tyson, Elon Musk using the science, and there's a 1% chance that we do not live in a simulated reality. If somebody could have created a simulated reality, they already would have done it and they were already placed us in it. It's just like the idea, if time travel is possible, somebody's already doing. So if simulation theory is possible, then we're already in a simulated reality, or part of us is. So that's just one facet where I say we live in Gnostic times, because the Gnostics 2,000 years ago ain't so crazy and wild conspiracy theories because of the simulation theory.
And just to add to what you said about Elon Musk, I was listening to one of his podcasts, or actually he was interviewed by Lex Friedman, and he says if there was one question you could ask to, some higher entity, what would you do? What would you ask? And he said he thought about it for a moment, and he said, "What is outside this simulation?" So, he completely, then in this way, he's absolutely Gnostic, right? So,
Yeah, yes. And
even
again,
the
the big
engineering
time smartest
geniuses,
scientists. Yeah.
yeah.
It's logical, it's mathematical, and it's very, very possible. So, and
So
it's very
what?
Gnostic.
So what the Gnostics envision now, engineers, in the Silicon Valley prove. So thank you so much, Miguel. It was a fantastic ride as usual. It is a little bit like a rodeo, like a Gnostic rodeo. I loved it. So before we disconnect, Miguel, how can our listeners connect with you?
Well, they got to get out of the simulation because I am beyond the, no, just kidding. I am not. I'm still working like you to get out of the simulation. See what's on the other side. No, but until then, I would say go to thegodabovegod.com. That's sort of Paul Tillich, who's Orthodox, created this idea of tongue in cheek because obviously the Gnostics had the demiurge and then they had a god, the true consciousness. So that he said the Gnostics believed in the God above God. So that's what I call my website, thegodabovegod.com. It's got my podcast, books, social media, videos. Contact me there if you have any questions. And there we go. That's my simulation.
And Miguel is an extremely prolific podcaster, and on top of this, he writes books and even gets interviews and so on. So and with this, we end our podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, sign in to Via the Goddess podcast. You can find the longer version of this conversation on my YouTube channel and consider buying my book, Via the Goddess, Mary Magdalene and the Goddesses of Eros and Secret Knowledge. Until next time.